Hi everybody, today we're going to continue learning about genetics, specifically patterns of inheritance. So today we're going to be talking about how you inherit your traits, how we can predict that inheritance both through Punnett squares and pedigrees, talking about dominant recessive traits, different patterns of inheritance, and also how the environment can influence what you look like. So before we get started, I just wanted to point out some important genetics vocabulary. These are some words that you're hopefully already familiar with, but if you're looking at the words on the screen now and realizing you do not recognize them, then there is a video specifically just for genetics vocabulary that I would suggest you go and watch now. The link should be on the screen and in the video description. If you feel confident with these words though, just keep watching. So the first question that we're going to talk about is, where do we get our traits from in the first place? And the answer is our parents. One half of our genetic material comes from our mom, and one half of our genetic material comes from our father. So remember that when we talked about meiosis, we talked about making these gametes, these haploid cells with half the genetic information. That's where these come in, because your mother is going to give you half of her traits, and your father is going to give you half of his traits. So this means that you actually have two copies of every trait in your body, one from one parent and one from the other. So the question then becomes, well, how do we know which traits we could end up with? Because each parent also has two copies of each trait, so they could pass on either one to you. You are getting an allele from each parent at random. And this is the reason that we use Punnett squares, because Punnett squares can show us the possibilities of inheritance for each trait. So let's say that your parents are both heterozygous. They have a dominant and a recessive trait. The Punnett square would look something like this. So our parents are circled in pink and red on the top and the side here. So you can see that in pink, we've got one parent, could be the mother or the father, and we've put their dominant trait first, that big P first, and then their recessive trait next, one over each box. Then to the side, we've put the other parent, circled in red. We put that big P first next to one box, and then we've got the little p after that next to the other box. Then we can start to sort of drag the traits in, find out where they overlap. So in this first box, you can see we have two arrows, one pointing down from the top and one pointing down from the side. And we just pull each of those alleles into the relevant box to find out what the possible offspring would look like. So in this first box, the offspring would have inherited both of the dominant traits from each parent. In the box to the right, that offspring inherited one dominant trait from one parent and one recessive trait. Now, this doesn't mean that if these parents have 4 children together, that it will look exactly like this. This is all just like rolling a dice or flipping a coin. It's all based on random chance. So it's possible that these two parents could end up with 4 children that all have little p, that all have the recessive trait. But statistically speaking, there is a 25% chance, 1 out of 4, that they'll get a child who is homozygous dominant. There's a 25% chance, 1 out of 4, that they'll get a child who is homozygous recessive. And there is a 50% chance, 1 out of 2, that they will have a heterozygous child like they are. So I want to quickly talk about dominant and recessive traits in regards to genotype and phenotype. So the letters we just talked about are all the genotype, but we're interested in knowing what the offspring looks like, what their phenotype is. So if we have a dominant allele, that uppercase letter, that means that we will see whatever the dominant trait is. So in this example here, the dominant trait is brown eyes and the recessive trait is blue eyes. So when we look at the offspring, we can see that 3 of them actually show brown eyes, even though we have those 2 who are heterozygous, because the brown eyes trait is dominant. So whenever you have the brown eyes and blue eye allele together, the brown eye will come out on top, and that will be the only trait we see. The only time that we see blue eyes is when we see 2 little b's at the same time. So Punnett squares are great if we want to just see the possible offspring for 2 people, 2 parents. But what if we want to look at the entire family and track their genetics? That's when we use something called a pedigree. Geneticists use pedigrees to track how traits are passed on throughout generations. So I've put a pedigree on the screen right now. Let me quickly talk about what we're seeing. Every circle you see is a female in the family, and every square you see is a male in the family. And you might notice that some circles and squares are shaded in and some aren't. That just means that whatever is shaded has the trait we're interested in, the trait being studied. This can change from pedigree to pedigree. So in one pedigree, you might be looking at tune deafness. In another pedigree, you might be looking at eye color. In another pedigree, you might be looking at hemophilia. It all changes depending on what you're interested in. So the shaded trait is always going to be something different. It's just whatever you're interested in. But the one thing that you really need to know how to do in a pedigree is use it to determine if a trait is dominant or recessive. So there's thankfully a pretty easy trick to doing this. All you need to do is look for when you have two parents that have the same trait, but they have a child with a different trait. So I'm going to put a very simple pedigree up on the screen right now. You can see here the two parents do not have the trait in question. They are both unshaded, so they have the same trait as each other. But you can see that one of their children does have the shaded in trait. So whatever that trait that the shaded in child has must be recessive. This is because the two parents, they have the dominant trait, but they must be heterozygous and be hiding that recessive trait. So they were able to pass it on to their child and have a child who looks different from them. Every time you're asked to look at a pedigree and determine if it's dominant or recessive, you should be looking for two parents who have the same trait as each other but have a child with a different trait, because whatever trait that child has is the recessive trait. So not all traits are dominant or recessive. We have other patterns of inheritance which make things a little more complicated. The first two that I want to talk about are incomplete dominance and codominance, because these are very similar to each other, but there's one distinct difference. In both of these cases, the organism that is heterozygous actually looks different from either of the other traits. So for instance, if you have a red flower and a white flower and you breed them together, the offspring will look pink instead of red or white. But the difference here is what that heterozygous thing looks like. With incomplete dominance, the heterozygous will look like a blending of the two traits. If you have blue and yellow, it will look green. Codominance, on the other hand, means that you actually see both traits still popping up. If you have blue and yellow, rather than seeing something that is green, you will see something that has blue and yellow spots. So incomplete, the things mix together. Codominant, they just both show up next to each other. Another means of inheritance is multiple alleles. So this just means that for any given trait, there are more than two versions of the gene that can be passed down. So an example of this that we talked about in class is blood types. So we actually have three different alleles for blood types. We have A, B, and O. And this leads to multiple different phenotypes. So rather than just having a dominant or recessive phenotype, we actually have four different phenotypes for blood type. We have type A, type B, type AB, and type O. So multiple alleles can lead to more than one trait being possible for one gene. We also have sex-linked traits. So sex-linked traits are still dominant and recessive, but rather than being carried on sort of our normal somatic chromosomes, they are instead carried on sex chromosomes. Humans have two sex chromosomes. Females will have XX and males will have XY. Some traits only get carried on the X chromosome. So this means that for males who only have one X chromosome, they're much more likely to get it because they've only got one shot to get a normal allele. If they get the X that is affected, then they definitely have the trait. Females, however, have two X chromosomes, which means that if they get one copy of an affected gene, they've got another copy that could be normal and not have the trait. This means that they're much less likely to get diseases that are carried on the X chromosome because they've got two shots to get a non-diseased allele. The last type of advanced inheritance that we're going to talk about is polygenic traits. So polygenic traits, these are traits like height, where rather than just having it being you're either 6 feet tall or 5 feet tall, you have a wide range of traits in the middle. And that's because there are multiple different genes affecting that one trait. So finally, we have to ask the question, are our traits all determined by genetics? And the answer is no. Not all of our traits are genetically based. Our phenotype is determined both by our genes and our environment. So our genes play a large part in that, but you can also affect things through your environment. So for instance, hair color isn't always genetically determined because if I don't like my hair color, I can dye it, and then my environment has affected my hair color. Or another example is to look at identical twins. Identical twins have the exact same genes, and you can tell they always look a lot alike, but you can have identical twins that start to look very different depending on their environment. So traits are determined both by genetics and the environment. So to sum up what we've learned, we know that our traits are inherited from our mother and our father. One half of our genes comes from mom, one half comes from dad. We can find out what the likelihood is of inheriting a trait from our parents by using a Punnett square. We can track traits through a family by using a pedigree. We know how to use dominant and recessive traits when we're determining genetics, and we know that there's a lot of exceptions to those rules. And finally, we know that our traits are determined both by our environment and by our genetics. So that is a summary overall of genetics. If you have any questions, please reach out to me and let me know. I'm happy to answer anything either through email or in the comments below. And I hope that you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, everybody.